Welcome to The Deep Dive, the place you come when you want the critical context and the clearest insights extracted from complex source material.
Today, we are undertaking an exploration of W. Cleon Skousen's very influential text, The 5,000-Year Leap.
And it is a cornerstone text for a certain way of understanding the philosophical architecture of the American founding.
It's an imposing source, for sure. And the title itself, it lays down a massive claim.
It really does.
Skousen asserts that the establishment of the American constitutional order represents the most significant single advance in human history.
A 5,000-year leap.
Exactly. A 5,000-year leap in political, technical, and economic achievement, all compressed and accomplished in just 2 centuries.
That is a revolutionary premise. Skousen is essentially claiming that before the American founding, humanity was just stuck in neutral for 5 millennia.
So let's start right there. What was the historic landscape he uses to justify the scale of this leap? Well, he begins by asking you to look back at the 5,000 years separating ancient civilizations. Think of Babylon, Egypt, even the Roman Republic, and compare that to the moment the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607. And what you find is startling stagnation. I mean, if you could transport a Babylonian engineer to the early 17th century, he would pretty much recognize the technology.
I remember these details from the sources, and they are quite striking. We tend to romanticize the past, but Skousen just lays out the practical reality of 1607.
Absolutely. The settlers crossed the Atlantic on ships that were no larger and certainly no safer than the ones used by ancient sea kings. Their tools were maybe a little refined, yes, but still essentially the same shovels and stick plows used for millennia.
And medicine.
Medicine was still a matter of superstition and bloodletting. And the result of all this, out of the first 9,000 settlers at Jamestown, 8,000 died young. For 50 centuries, humanity's condition was fundamentally unchanged. Poverty, disease, and political repression were just the norm.
But then, Skousen observes, the script completely flips. 2 centuries later, by the time of the U.S. bicentennial, we have global communication, the internal combustion engine, powered flight, and we've basically doubled the human lifespan. The progress is it's exponential.
And he attributes this not to some sudden burst of scientific genius, but to a radical change in political philosophy that, unlocked human potential.
So that's the core insight. The American experiment created a political container for liberty that was entirely new, and that container allowed innovation and prosperity to just explode.
Exactly. But to understand the system they built, we have to first look at the political yardstick the founders were using, which is completely different from our modern left-right scale.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Our modern scale generally pits communism against fascism, right? It's often centered around economic control.
Precisely. But the founders, according to Skousen, focused their scale entirely on a source and location of power.
So their spectrum ranged from what?
From tyranny on the far left, which meant too much government, all the way to anarchy on the far right, meaning no government at all. The modern labels were irrelevant to them. The crucial question was simply, does power flow from the ruler, or does it flow from the people?
Okay, so let's detail that extreme left, ruler's law. What defines that oppressive system in Skousen's interpretation?
Ruler's law is fundamentally top-down. All the power is consolidated in the hands of a single entity, a king, a dictator, a central governing committee, whatever it is.
And critically, the ruler views the country as his personal property.
His personal realm, exactly. And in this system, there are no unalienable rights. They're privileges, they're granted by the ruler, and they can be revoked instantly on a whim.
So government operates by the arbitrary whims of men, not by fixed, predictable law.
Which historically leads to terror, instability, and just sustained grinding poverty for the masses. It's government as a coercive mechanism, completely divorced from any kind of accountability or inherent moral limits.
So the alternative and the model the founders were reaching for was people's law.
Yes, and people's law completely reverses that power dynamic. It stems from the Anglo-Saxon common law tradition, and he traces it back even further to ancient Israel. Here, the people see themselves as a commonwealth of free men.
And the key characteristics are what? Dispersed power.
Dispersed and localized power. That's the key. Laws aren't considered arbitrary dictates from a king. They are rooted in natural and divine law, something that is known and accepted by the populace. Often, these laws were considered so fundamental they didn't even need to be constantly rewritten.
And this emphasis on localism under people's law is so essential to how the founders thought about problem solving.
Absolutely. In a system of people's law, the initial responsibility for addressing any problem rests first with the individual. If they can't solve it, it goes to the family, then the community, then the region, and only as an absolute last resort does it go to the nation.
So they solve problems at the lowest, most local level possible,
going no higher than absolutely necessary. And that's what kept central authority weak and accountable.
The structural contrast there is incredibly stark. Ruler's law is centralized and arbitrary. People's law is dispersed and fixed by a higher authority.
Right. And it's fascinating that the source mentions that the original intent for the Great Seal of the United States, proposed by Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, was actually to memorialize those two ancient examples of people's law, the Anglo-Saxons and ancient Israel.
So they understood they weren't inventing something entirely new. They were resurrecting a philosophy.
A philosophy of governance that had been suppressed for millennia, and that meant their great challenge was to find the balanced center.
Because history is filled with examples of nations struggling with this. After you shed a tyranny, you often rush headlong into the opposite extreme, which is anarchy.
And the early American experience proved this danger perfectly. The Articles of Confederation, which were created during this passionate rejection of monarchy, deliberately established a central government so weak.
No executive, no judiciary.
No power to tax or regulate commerce. It drifted disastrously close to anarchy.
And the famous historical example here is Valley Forge.
Yes, Valley Forge was so much more than a harsh winter. It was an unforgettable demonstration of the constitutional weakness caused by the Articles.
Because the Continental Congress couldn't enforce requisitions, right? They couldn't fund the army.
And thousands of men died, not in battle, but from starvation and a lack of supplies. That inability to govern proved to the founders that a stronger but still radically limited central government was absolutely essential.
So the genius of the 1787 Constitutional Convention was finding that balance structuring a government that was strong enough to function and defend itself, but also restrained enough to protect liberty. And that leads us to Skousen's powerful visual metaphor.
The three-headed eagle.
Right.
The three heads, legislative, executive, and judicial, represent that necessary separation of powers to prevent concentration. But the truly critical design feature is that all three heads operate through a single neck.
Coordination without consolidation. They are interdependent. No single branch can survive or function on its own.
They are designed to constantly check, balance, and restrain each other.
That's a perfect transition because the founders didn't trust those structural restraints alone. They knew they needed philosophical restraints. So let's move into part one and the foundational concept Skousen identifies, natural law. Why was natural law the essential, reliable basis for sound government?
Well, for the founders, natural law represented absolute objective truth. It's defined as eternal, universal, unchanging, and everlasting. It is right reason in agreement with nature, and critically, it's authored and enforced by God, the supreme creator.
So this isn't just about a moral preference, it's being posited as a fundamental statement about how the universe works. And Skousen argues that the founders were deeply influenced by thinkers who had reasoned this out centuries before Christianity. Most notably Cicero.
Cicero's insights were profoundly influential. He argued that the only intelligent approach to government, the only one that doesn't inevitably collapse into arbitrary rule, is to recognize and apply the laws established by this supreme creator.
And his reasoning was that if you reject this higher, unchangeable law, then your human laws are basically meaningless.
Exactly. It sets the standard for legislative legitimacy. If human legislation violates natural law, Cicero claimed it's not true law at all. It's a scourge to humanity, comparable to rules set by a band of robbers.
Think about the implication of that. It means that positive law, the law written by men, is constantly subject to a higher moral review.
Right. If a law mandates seizing private property without just cause or violates the right to self-defense, it is inherently illegitimate because it violates the fixed, unchangeable law of nature.
And it's amazing that Cicero, just through pure reason, landed on the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor, as the foundation of justice.
The glue of a just society, as he put it. It connects divine principle directly to social cohesion. The founders, who were influenced by John Locke, believed the existence of the Creator was the most fundamental premise underpinning all self-evident truth, including, of course, the rights in the Declaration of Independence.
And then you have legal minds like Sir William Blackstone cementing this idea. He argued that all human laws necessarily depend on two foundations.
The law of nature, which you can derive through scientific or philosophical investigation, and the law of revelation, found in Holy Scriptures. Any law, Blackstone insisted, which contradicts these divine foundations is invalid.
So the founders saw their entire constitutional project not as an invention, but as a recognition and application of pre-existing non-negotiable truths.
Which is why their belief in a providential hand actively involved in their affairs raises the emotional and moral stakes so high.
Skousen points to specific quotes here, doesn't he?
Oh, yes. Washington constantly attributed their success to divine intervention, and Madison explicitly mentioned seeing the finger of that almighty hand, securing independence and guiding the Constitutional Convention.
So this isn't casual deism.
Not at all. It's a belief that the American experiment was divinely sanctioned, which means the system itself was conditional upon maintaining a moral alignment with the Creator's laws. And this is why the structure demands so much from the citizenry.
Which brings us directly to the second philosophical pillar, the constitutional requirement of virtue and religion. If the system is conditional, what is the key condition?
Benjamin Franklin provided the maxim. Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters.
The implication there is profound. Freedom is not a guaranteed inheritance. It is a capacity possessed only by the virtuous.
So virtue, therefore, is the engine that runs the machine of the Constitution.
And we have to clarify what they meant by public virtue. This wasn't just about personal religious piety.
No. Public virtue was the active, conscious willingness to sacrifice one's immediate, private, or selfish interest for the greater good of the community. A republic just cannot function if every single individual is solely focused on their own gain.
Because eventually the government will have to step in with coercive force to manage all the inevitable conflicts of private interest.
Precisely. And Skousen details a pre-revolutionary reform movement where Americans self-consciously reflected on and tried to improve their moral capacity for self-government. They realized they had to be good citizens first to be successful self-governors.
George Washington really hammered this home in his farewell address, didn't he? Emphasizing that religion and morality are indispensable supports to political prosperity.
And he stressed that morality cannot be maintained without religion. Washington was essentially saying that the political sphere relies on a moral consensus, and that moral consensus can't survive without a source outside of the state, namely religion.
Which is a point that deeply impressed the great French jurist Alexis de Tocqueville when he visited America in 1831.
Yes, de Tocqueville's observation is one of the most remarkable parts of the source material. He found that in Europe, liberty and religion were often enemies.
But in the United States,
he was astonished to find them intimately united. De Tocqueville declared that religion was the first of their political institutions, not because the government established a church, but because religion provided the moral framework that stabilized the society.
It created a self-policing society. He said that while the law permitted Americans to do what they please, religion forbade them from committing what is unjust.
That is the perfect summary. It wasn't about imposing a specific dogma. Skousen emphasizes the kind of religion, a common denominator of moral teachings, often Christian morality, that transcended all the innumerable sects in America while still maintaining a separation between church and state. The moral stability was provided by the people's faith, allowing the government to function effectively while remaining limited.
And the consequence of neglecting this. John Adams' solemn warning is like the ultimate conditional clause on the entire American experiment.
Adams's warning is chilling, because it is so absolute. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
So if that moral prerequisite dissolves, the structural safeguards fail and the system requires masters.
Exactly, which leads us directly to how rights themselves were defined.
Rights, duties, and equality. The sixth principle is that rights are unalienable. What does Skousen stress about this term?
Unalienable means they cannot be separated from you. These are rights which God and nature have established, specifically life, liberty, and property, and which no human legislature has the legitimate power to abridge or destroy.
Unless the owner forfeits them through criminality.
Right. And the French economist Frédéric Bastiat provides the philosophical anchor here. He stated it so clearly: life, liberty, and property existed beforehand. These rights cause men to make laws for their protection in the first place.
So government is just an agent created to secure pre-existing rights, not the source of those rights.
That foundational shift rights from God, not from the state, is what made the American League possible.
Now, when the founders said all men are created equal, this concept has been historically contentious. Skousen provides some important clarification on the founders' view of equality.
They were very specific about it. Equality meant all men were equal in the sight of God, equal in the sight of the law, and equal in the protection of their rights. It was a legal and moral equality.
But they explicitly rejected the idea that men are equal in their capacities, their possessions, or their social status.
Right. It was equality of opportunity and protection, but not equality of outcome. Alexander Hamilton argued that inequality of condition would exist as long as liberty existed, because it results unavoidably from liberty itself.
And the discussion of rights naturally forces a corresponding discussion of unalienable duties, the often forgotten other side of the coin.
Yes. The divine law imposes duties right alongside the rights, and these duties are crucial for maintaining the social order without resorting to coercion.
Things like the duty to be economically self-sufficient or to maintain family integrity.
And the duty to be honest and respect others' property. But perhaps the most critical duty in the political sphere, the duty not to contrive through a covetous heart to despoil another.
That's the moral barrier against using the power of the state to redistribute property based on envy or just simple majority desire.
It's the moral prerequisite for protecting minority rights from majority rule.
And Skousen brings up a fascinating historical precedent for criminal justice embedded in this idea of duty, the reparation principle. How does this contrast with modern justice?
This principle, which is drawn from ancient Israel and Anglo-Saxon law, focuses on justice for the victim. God's superior law of criminal justice emphasizes reparation, restoration, and punitive damages paid directly to the victim, rather than just fines paid to the Commonwealth.
That shifts the entire focus of the criminal system. Instead of the state being the primary wronged party, the individual victim is paramount.
Precisely. If someone steals your cow, they don't just pay a fine to the county. They have to replace the cow and potentially pay punitive damages for your loss of livelihood. The goal is restoring the victim.
If the founders believed that virtue was required of the people, they clearly did not trust the inherent virtue of their rulers. So how did they build the government to survive human imperfection? This brings us to part 2, institutional design.
The entire design hinges on a very deep-seated distrust of power. They understood that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They totally rejected the European tradition of vesting faith in a benevolent dictator or some kind of enlightened elite.
Jefferson summarized this approach with his famous demand to bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution.
That visual, binding rulers with chains, it encapsulates their entire philosophy. James Madison provided the intellectual framework for this in Federalist 51.
Right. If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And since they knew they were dealing with neither, the government itself must be obliged to control itself.
And the vehicle for this control is the separation of powers, drawn significantly from Montesquieu's study of free governments.
Montesquieu argued that liberty is lost the moment consolidated power takes root. So the founders, following this divine science of good government, separated the power to make laws in the legislative branch, the power to administer them in the executive, and the power to interpret them in the judicial.
John Adams was the great champion of this idea, wasn't he?
He was. He fought strong opposition to enshrine separation of powers in the Massachusetts state constitution, making it the first. He understood that these three functions, enacting, executing, and judging, must be held by separate bodies, each with its own allegiance.
But separation alone, Madison realized, could lead to paralysis, or worse, one department could silently usurp the others.
And that's why the true genius lies in the checks and balances.
The powers must be separated, but then, as Madison put it, delicately laced back together again. So how does this lacing actually work in practice?
Well, the checks ensure that the departments have the necessary constitutional means and, importantly, the personal motives to resist encroachments from the others. The executive has the veto power over legislation.
And the judiciary has the power of review to strike down unconstitutional laws.
But then Congress, in turn, can impeach judges and the president. They can restrict the jurisdiction of the federal courts, and crucially, they control appropriations, the money, which is the ultimate check on the other two branches.
So that web of restraint provides a self-regulating mechanism for the entire structure. Skousen contrasts the American system with others that have to resort to violent coups to oust a leader who has usurped power.
The American system offers peaceful self-repair. Skousen points to the Watergate crisis as a dramatic example. When a sitting president was found to have abused executive power, the system of checks, specifically Congress and the judiciary, with support from the free press, worked to remove him without a single soldier in the street or a single bullet being fired. The constitutional machinery provided the path.
This carefully controlled central government was also designed with strict architectural limits on its scope and centralization through the system of federalism.
This is absolutely fundamental. The federal government was only delegated limited and carefully defined powers which are listed in the Constitution. The 9th and 10th Amendments explicitly reserved all other powers to the states or to the people.
It was a government of delegated powers, not a government of general jurisdiction.
Right. And Hamilton viewed the balance between state and federal power as a double security for the people, relying on the rivalship between the two levels of government.
The idea of rivalship is key. If the central government oversteps its bounds, the people have a protective ally in their state government, and vice versa.
It's a competitive relationship that's intended to prevent either from becoming too powerful, ensuring liberty is protected no matter where the threat comes from.
But Skousen identifies the golden key to preserving human freedom as local self-government. Why is the local level so indispensable?
Jefferson provided a powerful warning here. He argued that safety for liberty lay in dividing and subdividing power down to the smallest possible unit, from the national level down to the state, the county, the town.
And finally, the administration of every man's farm by himself.
He believed that the danger lay in generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. That centralization, whether it's controlled by autocrats or even an aristocratic Senate, destroys accountability and responsiveness.
Because local government is closer to the people, it's more transparent and easier to influence and control.
Exactly. When problems are solved locally, the central authority never gains the scope or the budget to become truly tyrannical.
This emphasis on the state's role as a check leads to one of Skousen's most pointed critiques of structural drift, the impact of the 17th Amendment. Why does he see this 1913 amendment as such a seismic shift?
Because the 17th Amendment mandated the popular election of senators. Before 1913, senators were appointed by the state legislatures. And Skousen argues that this change destroyed the state's institutional ability to check federal power.
How did it destroy that check?
Well, the Senate was originally designed to represent the state government as a corporate entity, the sovereign state's interest in Washington. A senator appointed by the legislature was primarily accountable to that legislature, meaning their job was to guard the state's reserved powers against federal overreach.
But once senators became beholden to the popular electorate, their allegiance shifted.
Completely. They became national politicians focused on satisfying broad public demands and, critically, securing federal spending for their state rather than defending the sovereignty of their state governments.
So it fundamentally weakened that rivalship and allowed the central government to expand its jurisdiction without the institutional resistance of the states.
Precisely. Without the Senate acting as a voice for state sovereignty, the path was cleared for the federal government to impose mandates and use federal funding to force state compliance, basically circumventing the 9th and 10th Amendments.
Let's pivot now to the crucial intersection of liberty and economics, which Skousen shows was absolutely non-negotiable for the founders. The 14th principle is that life and liberty are secure only so long as the right to property is secure.
They viewed property not just as material wealth, but as an extension of life and liberty itself. Lincoln famously called property the fruit of labor and a positive good in the world.
The idea being, if a man is not entitled to the fruit of his labor, then his labor is not his own and he's functionally a slave.
Right. Justice Sutherland stressed that the three great rights, life, liberty, and property, are so bound together as to be essentially one. Violating one affects the others.
And John Adams elevated property protection to a moral imperative. He warned that if the idea is admitted that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, anarchy and tyranny commence.
That implies that respect for economic autonomy is the first thing that breaks down before the entire political structure collapses.
And this sanctity of property naturally dictates the economic structure, leading to the free market formula, the 15th principle. Skousen credits Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations as the inspiration here.
Smith's ideas resonated because they aligned with the founders' belief in self-reliance and limited government. The American system was built on specialization, free exchange, competition, and allowing profits to function as the incentive for worthwhile production.
Skousen distills this economic freedom into the 4 laws of economic freedom. Let's walk through those.
Okay, first, the freedom to try. This is the entrepreneurial freedom to innovate, to start a business, to pursue a new method.
Second, the freedom to buy, the freedom of the consumer to choose the best product at the best price. That disciplines the market.
Third is the freedom to sell. The freedom to offer your products and services without undue governmental interference in price or supply.
And the fourth one, the one that often causes the most political friction, the freedom to fail.
That is the essential counterweight. The freedom to fail incentivizes accountability and wise risk-taking. If a person or a business is insulated from the consequences of poor decisions, resources get wasted and innovation stagnates. The freedom to fail acts as a constant engine of efficiency.
Skousen charts the success of this system up until the early 20th century, but he notes a critical economic drift starting around 1900.
Yes. Post-1900, Adam Smith's principles began to be actively replaced in academic and political circles by ideas from Karl Marx and other collectivists. He points to influential groups like the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, which later became the League for Industrial Democracy.
The sources suggest that by the 1920s, centralization and collectivist ideas were openly discussed in colleges as superior to the founders' limited government model.
The vacuum left by rejecting the founders' moral and economic framework was quickly filled by central planning ideas, and Skousen points out the historical irony here. While the founders' system led to unprecedented prosperity, the collectivist movements that replaced it, whether Soviet communism or other centrally planned states, resulted in economic collapse and mass tyranny.
This contrast brings us back to a vital distinction the founders made: the difference between a republic and a democracy. Why did they so deliberately create a republic?
Because the founders viewed pure democracy, meaning simple majority rule, as inherently unstable and dangerous. The 1928 U.S. Army Training Manual, which he cites, defined a democracy as a government of the masses, which often devolves into mobocracy.
And it had an attitude toward property that was communistic, meaning the majority could simply vote to seize the property of the minority.
Which fundamentally violates the sanctity of unalienable rights. A republic, by contrast, is defined by respect for laws and individual rights, administered in accord with fixed principles and established evidence. The constitutional order was designed to be a republic to prevent the majority from violating the natural rights of life, liberty, and property guaranteed to the minority.
And this provides the context for Skousen's most significant political warning: the rejection of welfare statism and debt.
This is encapsulated in the 7th principle. Government's proper role is to protect equal rights, not provide equal things. Skousen argues that the moment the government is authorized to level material possessions, to seize property from some to distribute to others, it commits legal crimes.
Samuel Adams, Skousen emphasizes, declared that welfare statism and communal property ideas were made explicitly unconstitutional by the founders. That is a very strong statement.
It is. It anchors the government strictly to its defensive mission. And this rejection wasn't due to a lack of compassion, but due to a belief in what he calls calculated compassion.
Benjamin Franklin's idea.
Right. Helping the needy help themselves, and strictly enforcing a scale of fixed responsibility. It started with the individual, then the family, then the church, the community, and finally the local county or state for genuine emergencies.
But under no circumstances was the federal government to become involved in public welfare.
Because they believed it would corrupt both the government by giving it unconstitutional powers and the poor by creating dependency. President Grover Cleveland echoed this later, arguing that federal aid weakens the national character.
If welfare statism is one profound error, the other is debt, the new bondage. Franklin's quote here is blunt. Think what you do when you run in debt: you give to another power over your liberty.
Debt exchanges a present advantage, the spending for a future obligation, which is a form of bondage imposed on future generations.
Thomas Jefferson was especially emphatic on this, calling inherited debt taxation without representation imposed by one generation on the next. He demanded prompt debt repayment.
And here is where Skousen introduces the dramatic historical data. He shows that every prior generation of Americans, up until the Great Depression era of the 1930s, adhered to this principle. They struggled, but they paid down the national debt after major conflicts.
And that foundational principle was broken then.
Yes. The shift after 1930 opened the floodgates for what Skousen calls splurge spending and activities far outside the constitutionally defined scope. This led to the staggering federal outlays and debt we see today.
He provides a deeply cynical but maybe accurate comparison of the modern taxpayer to an addict needing a fix.
It's a harsh analogy. He says the taxpayer denounces the massive debt and excessive spending on one hand, but protests violently against any politician who attempts the necessary withdrawal. That is, significant budget cuts. This confirms the founders' understanding of human nature. The debt crisis is seen as a sign that the conditional framework is failing.
We've established the philosophical prerequisites and the structural safeguards. So now, let's look at the elements required for the conditional framework to endure, the means by which the republic sustains itself. The first is the indispensable role of education.
A free society cannot survive as a republic without a broad, high-quality program of general education, specifically designed to ensure an educated electorate capable of discerning truth and exercising virtue.
John Adams in Massachusetts provided the early model. As early as 1647, the state required communities to establish free grammar schools and secondary schools with the explicit purpose of diffusing knowledge generally among the people.
And this was a necessity, not a luxury. But this early American education was never divorced from morality and politics. De Tocqueville observed that Americans learned law not just from books, but by actively participating in legislation, local government, and juries.
The expectation was that an educated electorate understood the structure, the philosophy, and the moral prerequisites of the system.
Exactly. Second is the necessity of freedom through strength. Prosperity attracts predators. This addresses the external danger.
Franklin's maxim was simple and clear. One sword often keeps another in the scabbard. Government has an absolute, non-negotiable duty to provide adequate national defense.
And Washington's counsel was definitive too. He argued that the U.S. must establish a rank due among nations, and that rank will be withheld if the nation acquires a reputation for weakness.
The founders were realists. They knew peace required preparation for war,
which was coupled with their ideal foreign policy articulated by Jefferson. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none.
That maxim perfectly encapsulates the desire to maximize commercial relations while minimizing political connections.
Right. Washington warned against indulging in habitual hatreds or passionate attachments to specific nations, arguing that such emotional ties make a nation a slave to its animosity or to its affection.
Which connects seamlessly to the final principle, manifest destiny. And Skousen defines this term not as territorial conquest or global domination, which is often the modern connotation.
The founders' vision of manifest destiny was to be a shining example and a blessing to the entire human race. It was an internal mission, proving that men are capable of establishing good government through reflection and choice, rather than being forever destined to depend on accident and force.
Hamilton articulated this core challenge in the Federalist Papers. The people of America were reserved, he argued, to decide the most important question in political philosophy. Can societies truly govern themselves?
America was meant to be the working model of the 5,000-year leap. But Skousen returns again and again to his ultimate warning. The constitutional order is not a perpetual machine. It is, at its heart, a conditional framework.
So the survival of the leap depends entirely on the character, the virtue, and the continuous vigilance of a free people to remember and practice those 28 philosophical foundations.
The sources show the founders were under no illusion that their work guaranteed eternal freedom. They understood that human nature is fallible and that the system, left unattended, would naturally drift toward centralization, debt, and eventually tyranny.
So what does this deep dive into Skousen's work mean for us today? He highlights a profound and, dangerous tension. The American system is exceptional because it limits government power while simultaneously requiring an unlimited commitment to virtue and moral responsibility from its citizens.
The founders rejected blind veneration for antiquity to create the most spectacular leap forward in human history. They built the conditional framework.
So the final provocative thought that Skousen leaves us with is this. If that leap was entirely conditional on foundations we have, you could argue, increasingly abandon financial prudence, local responsibility, and public virtue, are we currently engaged in a progress in reverse?
The leap, it seems, continues only as long as we choose vigilance over complacency.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.